We spend about $4 trillion per year in healthcare. And depending on which report you read, experts have characterized waste as about 20 to 30%. So
Wow.
roughly speaking, like about 1 trillion of that doesn't really improve patient outcomes. It's really waste, and administrative inefficiency is definitely a huge portion of it. A lot of the tools and products that AI enables require complete rethinking of the go-to-market strategy. As a primer, if we can predict non-invasively within minutes, and we do this screening in a community outside of traditional healthcare settings, such as the supermarket, that really completely reimagines how healthcare is delivered and a patient's experience.
Welcome to the Digital Healthcare Experience, brought to you by Taylor Healthcare. Subscribe now and stay on the forefront of the digital healthcare revolution.
Hello and welcome to the Digital Healthcare Experience podcast presented by Taylor Healthcare. I'm your host, Chris Civitarese, and today I'm joined by Dr. T.Y. Alvin Liu, a practicing retinal surgeon who holds dual faculty appointments at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and School of Engineering. He is also the inaugural director of the Gills Artificial Intelligence Innovation Center and was named the Gills Rising Professor of Artificial Intelligence in Ophthalmology. As an interdisciplinary strategist at the intersection of venture capital, startup companies, and health systems, Dr. Liu specializes in the implementation and scaling of healthcare AI technologies in both clinical and operational domains. He also serves as co-chair of the AI and Data Trust Council, a leadership team that oversees all AI initiatives across the entire Johns Hopkins medical health system in the imaging, clinical, and operational domains. And on a national level, he's a member of the American Academy of Ophthalmology AI Committee and represents ophthalmology at the American Medical Association AI Specialist Society Collaborative Meeting. Welcome, Dr. Liu. It's fantastic to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Chris. And I really look forward to our conversation today.
Excellent. And to start, I'm hoping that you can give us a little bit more background about the work that you're doing at Johns Hopkins and the AI Innovation Center. And I would especially love to hear a little bit more about your role on the AI oversight team as well.
Sure. Happy to give some background information. But perhaps before I start, I'd like to give you a little story in terms of how I got started in artificial intelligence to begin with. So this started back in 2018. At that time, I was finishing up my training as a retinal surgeon. And I knew that I had the privilege of staying on as faculty at Johns Hopkins Medicine. And I had to focus in one particular area. Around that time, one of the earlier papers when it comes to the modern form of AI called deep learning came about. And it demonstrated that an AI model can predict someone's age, biological sex, and blood pressure just by looking at a retinal image. And once I knew about that study, I knew that that really represents a superhuman capability by AI. And I got attracted to it and hooked right away. And I told myself, this is something that's going to change medicine and society as we know it. And that's what I want to focus on. So fast forward to now, the vast majority of my involvement in Johns Hopkins Medicine is indeed in artificial intelligence. As you mentioned, I am still a practicing retinal surgeon. However, I do spend the majority of my time in artificial intelligence in two different ways. The first bucket, so to speak, is the Gills AI Center that you mentioned. So this was made possible by a very generous donation of $10 million by Dr. Gills and his family. And fortunately for us, it was also the first ever endowed AI center at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. This donation really enabled many kind of infrastructure work when it comes to AI. As you probably know, like to perform AI research and really to push the envelope of AI, many kind of resources are needed. For example, access to data, access to GPUs, and computer science talents, which are pretty hard to come by. So what this endowment allowed me to do as the director of the center is to really plan for these resources for the long run. So now I can confidently retain talent for years. I can, so buy and retain GPU resources for my faculty members ahead of time. So all of a sudden, I'm planning on a 5, 10 year horizon, but not just 2 or 3 years. So this very much is an infrastructure play, and that allows me to provide a lot of communal resources to faculty members at my department, the Wilmer Institute, which also happens to be the largest academic ophthalmology department in the country. And we have over 100 faculty members just in our department. The second bucket, when it comes to AI involvement at Johns Hopkins, is at a health system level. So the school of medicine does work very closely with the health system, but there is a little bit of a difference between the two. The school of medicine, it's part of the university. I am on the faculty at a school of medicine, versus Johns Hopkins Medicine, the health system, is the operational arm when it comes to healthcare. So Johns Hopkins Medicine has 6 hospitals and about 50 outpatient clinical sites. And about a year ago, the leadership at the health system realized the need and for responsible deployment of AI. And to that end, they decided to establish an AI oversight team. And currently, including myself, there are 8 people on this leadership team. And our mandate really covers all things AI related across the health system. Most importantly, we have established standard operating procedures that governs the interaction between our health system AI and vendors in a standardized way to evaluate these vendors when it comes to the performance, efficacy, and safety of their products if we do decide to deploy these products in a health system.
It's really fascinating. And I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about your, I guess I'll say kind of the mission of the AI Center? So incredible that Johns Hopkins has sort of, recognized that at the health system level, they need governance and process and, so on and so forth around AI. Can you talk a little bit more about the AI Center and the mission of what you're trying to accomplish there?
Sure. So the AI Center, as I mentioned, was made possible by a very generous donation by Dr. Gills, who many years ago also trained at Wilmer. And he went on to have a very successful career in medicine and also a fantastic business person. If you're aware of the Iron Man franchise, so he actually started and sold it afterwards. So he, besides
Incredible.
being a fantastic ophthalmologist himself, he also was very successful in various business ventures. So he came in and gave this donation with a very broad mandate, which is how do we push forward artificial intelligence in medicine overall, and definitely specifically in ophthalmology. And it's up to me to figure out how to do that. So taking that mandate, I started off with thinking about first principle, which is how do we maximize the positive impacts of AI in ophthalmology? And what I came up with has several, different facets to it. One is, of course, we are Johns Hopkins, so doing cutting edge research is very important. And I briefly alluded to the fact that in order to perform cutting edge AI research, one does need a lot of resources, for example, access to GPUs and computer science talent. So this center certainly provides for that. However, we will also like to think one step ahead because oftentimes the issue with research and innovation is a lot of the things that people end up inventing, they end up sitting on a shelf or in the patent office, and they never really end up touching patients per se. So in order to turn useful research, cutting edge research, into useful, impactful tools that impact patients, I think we also need to build a very wide coalition to bring these research results into fruition. And within this coalition, there are other very important players, such as the startup industry that is doing very innovative work in terms of startup companies, and also various kinds of, for example, venture capital fund. Because if you marry the brains of smart researchers and the innovative spirits of founders and the potential and the fuel provided by venture capital firms, when you combine all these 3 things together, I firmly believe that's how we really push the envelope and really maximize the positive impacts of AI.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I have to imagine that, the scale of a large academic health system like Johns Hopkins, obviously the academic side of the house at Johns Hopkins, as you described, the university, private industry, that's a very interesting marriage to kind of bring together all of those parties.
Yes, I think this kind of alliance does exist around the country,
Mhm.
but it's not very common. And also, just because you have built an alliance doesn't mean you can really, make the alliance work together. So I think the devil's in the details in terms of how to come up with a way for all the different parties to work together and still align the incentives of all those stakeholders. And I'll give you an example. At most universities and health systems, there are indeed an entity called Tech Transfer Office.
Mhm.
So the goal of these offices is to translate research from faculty members into like a commercial products. Historically, the vast majority of the research or insights coming out from universities when it comes to healthcare belong to the therapeutic side. For example, if a professor discovers a molecule, you can change that into a particular kind of medicine. Or if a professor invents a medical device, then you go down the FDA route. I think that in the era of AI, the kind of products that are being developed and the route to commercialization are indeed very different than the first two examples.
Right.
For example, when it comes to medications, the usual route is you patent the molecule and then you license out the molecule to a big pharma. It's really hard to do that when it comes to software. And oftentimes, in
Right.
order to capture the real value of AI related products, you have to go down the company route, but you can't just simply license it out. And that has to do with the nature of the business of AI and also with the rapidly advancing foundation AI models. I think the moat surrounding AI technology is getting smaller and smaller. And the real value creation is really how you build a product around it, and also whatever you end up building, how that fits into a particular workflow. So the value add is the workflow and the process, a little bit less about the product. But of course, the product itself has to be good as well.
Makes a lot of sense, and I'd love to bring it back to sort of a more concrete example of some of the work that you're doing, and we'll bring it back to obviously your specialty of ophthalmology. I am fascinated by this concept. You've described the retina as a window into the body, and you alluded to it a little bit in the introduction as well. Can we talk a little bit about the retina and what makes it so uniquely valuable for diagnosing conditions like dementia or heart disease, or what are the other types of things that we can glean about our body through the lens of retina health?
The retina is the back part of your eye. Essentially, for those who are old enough who remember a non-digital camera, it's the film in the camera. And for those who only know about digital camera, it's the computer chip in the camera. So if the retina doesn't work, your vision won't work. The retina is a very unique organ in the sense that it's a direct extension of your brain. So when you are an embryo and grow inside your mother's womb, the brain literally creates an extension, add that, and that becomes your retina. The retina also has a lot of blood vessels. So it's in terms of you measure blood flow per a unit of area, it is one of the organs inside the body that receives the highest amount of blood flow. So that's why it's such a unique organ. What's also nice about the retina is you can image the retina non-invasively, meaning you can image and measure many kind of metrics when it comes to blood flow and brain tissue at the same time. And there really is no other organ in the body where you can do that. So for many years, decades now, we do know that there are a lot of associations between what's happening in the retina and the rest of the body. So, for example, if your blood pressure is really, really high for many years, it does show up in the retina. And another very common example is if you have poorly controlled diabetes, we can see signs of that in the retina. However, these associations between the retina and the rest of the body have been relatively weak until now. What changed is that now we can combine retinal images and the cutting edge form of AI, which is called deep learning, that is particularly good at image analysis. Once you combine these two things, the amount of useful information we can get out of the retina increases exponentially. So, what can it do? You're right. I briefly mentioned that at the earlier part of a conversation. That's exactly what got me into AI to begin with. So back in about 2018, we can predict someone's age, sex, smoking status. those are pretty cool concepts, but not super helpful in real life because I can just simply tell you how old I am, right?
Right.
Now in 2025, the kind of predictions we can make are much, much better and much more important.
Mm,
So I will categorize these predictions into three major buckets. The first bucket has to do with heart health, which is whether someone is at a higher risk in the near future for having some heart related events such as a
mm,
heart attack. And the second one has to do with brain health, specifically dementia and Alzheimer's, Alzheimer's being the most common form of dementia. The third bucket is any issues with the kidney. So
mm.
the commonality for all of these conditions is that they all have to do with blood vessels. And in particular, when it comes to dementia and Alzheimer's, that has to do with brain tissue as well. So I will say these three buckets is where the future is heading. And as a primer, as you can probably imagine, if we can predict these things non-invasively within minutes, and we do this kind of screening in a community outside of traditional healthcare settings, such as the supermarket, that really completely reimagines how healthcare is delivered and a patient's experience. And that's exactly what I mean by a lot of the tools and products that AI enables require complete rethinking of the go-to-market strategy and hence business plans and new allies and new partners in the ecosystem as well.
So fat. I mean, that is such a paradigm shift to be able to do this in a non-invasive way. To your point, I mean, they could be deployed in any place where people kind of gather, retail, community settings, all of that. And I think about, I mean, the impact in terms of early diagnosis and in terms of access. That's a real game changer. It sounds like.
I think from a public health perspective, for sure, if this is deployed correctly, it will massively improve access. And that at that level, I don't think anyone can argue that it's a bad thing. However, it does have a lot of downstream repercussions, right? Because now the upstream patient acquisition funnel is massively larger,
Right.
which really should translate into a lot of downstream referrals. Then the question becomes: it's great that now access is improved, and we're now catching a lot of patients with undiagnosed chronic conditions. Are we as a society now currently set up to take care of these patients downstream? And if the answer is yes, what are the economic implications? Like, who's going to be paying for the downstream care, or who's going to be paying for the upstream screening? Or perhaps, like, do we now need to reimagine the entire patient journey and think about vertical integration and think about the net cost benefit analysis from a vertically integrated model, considering from the very beginning of the patient journey, which is getting screened and identifying a community, down to the referral to maybe primary care, maybe specialist care, maybe even like more downstream intervention. So I think no one really knows the answer to that, and this really creates a lot of unforeseen situations, hopefully for the better. And I think a lot of work still needs to be done to figure out the economics of it, who's making the investment, and how do you calculate the return on investment in this situation.
It's really fascinating. And I want to turn the conversation now to the work that you do outside of your medicine, your work in medicine and your work in academia. As you mentioned, you're deeply involved with healthcare startups and venture capital. I'm curious about how that perspective shapes how you think about AI adoption in the clinical space. And I'm curious about kind of the inverse too. How does your experience in the clinical space with AI and all these possibilities shape your view of startups and venture capital?
If we take a step back and think about the strength of America overall, and we're not even, looking at healthcare, I think the very vibrant startup ecosystem and the fuel provided by venture capital, these two factors are very important. In fact, there have been various studies done comparing the economic trajectory and stock market trajectory in the past 50 years or so, comparing the US and the rest of the world. And we started seeing this really large divergence between the US and even other rich developed countries in the past 50 years. And when you do very deep economic analysis, it's highly likely that the outperformance of the US economy has something to do with the startup ecosystem and the fact that very smart and motivated, ambitious people are allowed to take big risk with the support of venture capital. So I will preface everything that I say by saying that there's very good evidence to show that the success of America in the economy, including healthcare, has a lot to do with the startup ecosystem and venture capital. And that's why I'm so passionate about this, in this area, particularly at the intersection and collaboration between venture capital, startup, and academia. So that's sort of the premise of the conversation. And going back to your specific question in terms of how that has informed the way I look at innovation in healthcare I would say the biggest revelation is the importance of who's paying for it. Ultimately, if you invent something and there's no way forward for that to get paid, it will ultimately fail. And even if you get initial good traction, if there's not a financially sustainable payment model, the intervention or the product will still fail in the long run. This in turn really pushed me to think about either the kind of research I'm doing or kind of company I work with, who's going to pay for that ultimate, service. So I would say, like, from this perspective, there are two insights that I gained from me looking at history and just understanding history. One is, as I mentioned, very important to think about who's going to be paying for what at what point. So that's one question that I think about all the time. And the second issue is when it comes to healthcare, particularly, it's very tricky. What that means is, vast majority of healthcare AI services right now are provided or packaged in terms of devices. So mainly in diagnostic, and they are regulated as AI-enabled medical devices under purview of the FDA. This means that deployment of these products could be very expensive. You need to find the money and capital to do a clinical trial, usually, to get through the FDA. And even you get through the FDA, there's no guarantee that you're going to get paid. Like, you need to negotiate and establish with the American Medical Association for your device or service to be covered under an existing CPT code or a new one. And this process takes a long time. And even if you end up getting a permanent CPT code to cover for a service, there's no guarantee that the payers will be willing or able to reimburse your specific CPT code at a level that's financially viable. So I think these things have very real financial and operational implication for startup companies or venture capital funds that want to invest in certain companies in terms of where the future is. So very difficult path overall. And I would even go one step further and say this, in the long run, will likely hamper the deployment and development of medical AI tools because simply it's so hard for the inventors to get paid to begin with. So that will really stifle innovation in the long run. I think what needs to happen is a very different way, or at least a modification of the current way of approving these products. And second, we need to think about value a little bit differently. And currently, most AI-enabled medical devices are paid per click, essentially. You use it once, you get paid, or it's a subscription fee. It's really hard to capture the real value of these services in its totality. So maybe down the road, a more viable strategy is to think of these devices as a loss leader in a vertically integrated payment system where you still pay these screening services that's good for public health and good for patients overall upfront, even though you may not make money at the screening phase, but recognize and appreciate the downstream value that they provide and give them back some of the revenue. Again, very not the way that we do things right now, but I do think that something needs to be changed.
Fascinating. I'm curious about the patterns and the trends that you're seeing in your work in the venture and startup space. What patterns and trends are you seeing in AI or big data startups? And that could be from the seed stage up through the Series C stage, kind of everything in between. I'm curious if you're seeing any trends that are emerging that are interesting from your perspective.
Sure. I think the major trend right now is definitely generative AI. So I mentioned earlier that the cutting edge AI technique is called deep learning. Deep learning is good at two things. One is pattern recognition, such as image analysis. And this really fueled a lot of the AI-enabled medical devices that I mentioned earlier for example, in the ophthalmology space or radiology space. With the rise of large language model, this landscape has completely changed. As you can probably imagine, many parts of healthcare is very labor intensive and inefficient. So what I see post the rise of ChatGPT is healthcare AI products that have to do with generative AI, specifically large language model. It also makes sense from the macro sense because we spend about $4 trillion per year in healthcare. And depending on which report you read, experts have characterized waste as about 20 to 30%. So,
Wow.
roughly speaking, like each year, although we spend $4 trillion in healthcare, about 1 trillion of that doesn't really improve patient outcomes. It's really waste. And there are many different kinds of waste, but administrative inefficiency is definitely a huge portion of it. So what I've seen in the startup scene and also venture capital side, the hottest category of healthcare AI products have to do with generative AI products based on large language models that solve very specific workflow related pain points. And I'll give you two specific examples. One specific example is revenue cycle management. Essentially, that is the way that providers such as doctors, hospitals, and health systems get paid. I see a patient, I document what I did for the patient, I submit a claim, the claim goes to the insurance company, and they pay me. So that's essentially revenue cycle management.
Yep.
There's a lot of paperwork involved in that. And this process itself costs us, the US, about $200 billion. So really just purely paperwork for doctors to get paid. That's $200 million. $200 billion. So a lot of that processes can be automated and made more efficient using generative AI. So there are a lot of companies doing that right now. And they have been able to demonstrate positive return on investment by making a lot of these processes better. Another example for Gen AI in healthcare is the use of this technology in clinical trials. So, as you know, clinical trial is a very important part of medicine. That's how we push the envelope of therapeutics and generate enough credible data for new medications to be approved by FDA. Again, very, very complicated process. You have the pharmaceutical company sponsoring the trial. You have the clinical research organization that sort of quarterbacks the clinical sites, and you have the clinical trial sites themselves. You have many different players, and for the data to be good enough for FDA, there are many kind of data sources that are related to a particular clinical trial that need to be integrated and then combined and then to submit to the FDA. Again, very chaotic system right now when it comes to data management. Generative AI, especially the agentic form, meaning they can actually do something, not just understand our language, can really be the background worker that coordinates a lot of different data sources when it comes to a clinical trial. So I think these are two use cases that are real. It's happening in the real world right now. That will be the first noticeable impact of Gen AI in healthcare as we know it.
And obviously, in the world of AI, particularly from an AI-driven care perspective, there are going to be, I assume, some barriers and some things that we're going to need to sort of adjust and get over. So I'm curious, looking ahead, as you think about the concept of AI-driven care, what has to happen legally, professionally, from a regulatory or legislative perspective or anything else for that really to become a reality?
AI raises a lot of interesting legal questions, which we do not have to answer that. And
right.
Actually, on that end, I'll be joining a panel in a couple of months in Chicago that's hosted by the American Bar Association on exactly this topic, which is the intersection of law and healthcare AI. And there are two very big issues that came to my mind right away. As you can imagine, if you use the different chatbots like ChatGPT or Grok or whatnot, you can really get pretty decent medical information just by talking to these large language models.
Right.
In fact, there are a lot of large language models that are specialized and fine-tuned on medical information now that really can do quite a good job. Maybe it's not as good as a world-class, doctor, but it can really serve a lot of functions. So I can see in the not too distant future, you have an AI nurse or AI mid-level medical professional that can do the job on the mid-level medical professional. So the first question is, how do you incorporate this kind of, let's just call AI nurses into medical care. It's tricky because, as I mentioned, the traditional way by which the FDA regulates AI-enabled medical devices really is inadequate for Gen AI. In fact, the FDA put out a statement specifically saying that the current framework is not adequate to regulate and consider Gen AI products. Even the FDA said it itself. So the question becomes, how do you certify these so-called AI doctors, AI nurses? Perhaps one of the ways to think about them is, instead of pushing them through the FDA route and have them approved as medical products, we credential these products as though they were human. Like after I was done with my medical training, I didn't go through FDA approval, right? What I did go through is a board certification, meaning, I go in front of a panel of ophthalmologists. They ask me a variety of questions, both written and oral interactive questions on ophthalmology. And of course, I'm human, so I did not get every single answer correct. But just because I did not get every single answer correctly, I was still board certified because, the board and the panel decided a level of competency that is necessary and sufficient to practice medicine. So I could imagine a scenario that in the future, like AI doctors and nurses, instead of going through FDA approval, maybe they can be certified by a human board and say, yes, you reach certain thresholds. Yes, you can participate in the provision of care. Of course, this is theoretical, but that's one of the interesting legal questions that we have to wrestle. The second big legal question is, now we know in a variety of clinical settings, if you combine a human with AI, this combo will outperform a human alone without any help from AI. The legal question becomes 5 or 10 years down the road, when we accumulate more and more use cases and more evidence that in certain situations, human plus AI really is better than human. Then the question becomes, if a human does not use AI, does that represent substandard care? So these are theoretical questions, of course, but I think these are the questions that we will have to wrestle as a society very soon.
They're such fascinating thought experiments. They really are. The notion of an AI standing in front of a medical board, going through credentialing is just, that is, if that's not something out of a sci-fi book that everybody can kind of get their arms around, I don't know what is. It's absolutely incredible.
And the issue with the AI doctor also has philosophical and moral implications, because there are
Absolutely.
certain parts in the U.S. and definitely in the world, unfortunately, patients have access to zero healthcare.
That's
So
right.
the argument becomes, is it better for humans to have zero access to healthcare, or access to an AI doctor that is 50% good, not 100%? That arguably is better than nothing, right? So that's
Right.
also, but if we, sit on a high horse and say, well, like, it's only 50% good, it's not as good as a human, and hence you cannot use it, are we doing a disservice to people who have zero access to healthcare to begin with? So that's also an ethical and moral dilemma.
We're going to have you back on the show to explore some of this further, especially as it continues to kind of crystallize, within the federal government, within the private sector, within the medical sector. I feel like we could spend a whole episode on some of these topics, but unfortunately, we're running up on our time. I know, and we'll get you out of here on this one, Dr. Liu. Is there anything else that you're working on, excited about, anything at all that you want to share with the community?
Well, Chris, I've really enjoyed our conversation today, and I think all the topics we talked about are very important to me, and I'm excited about all of them. If I have to pick one topic, I'll perhaps go back to the healthcare from the eye concepts, where the official name is Oculomics, which is the study of the associations between retinal finding and the rest of the body. That is a topic that's of immense interest to me, partly because I'm a retinal surgeon by training, and also, historically, retinal specialists are considered hyper specialists, right? We do very specialized work. We love what we do, but ultimately, we only touch a very small portion of patients, relatively small portion of patients with specific retinal problems. If this healthcare from the eye and oculomics really starts working out, then all of a sudden we, ophthalmologists and retinal specialists have a chance to really have a bigger impact on greater society beyond just patients with retinal problems.
It's such great work that you're doing. I thank you for all the work that you're doing in the space. As you say, it could be really revolutionary from a patient perspective. And I so appreciate you joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Liu. It was a pleasure having you on.
Thank you, Chris, for your time. The pleasure is mine.
And thank you also to our listeners. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like, share, and subscribe to help us keep growing the show. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Taylor Healthcare and the digital healthcare experience, you can go to taylor.com/digital-healthcare. That's our show for today. And until next time, I'm Chris Civitarice, wishing you health and good cheer. Take care.
To learn more about Taylor Healthcare, please visit taylor.com/digital-healthcare. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is provided with the understanding that it does not constitute medical, legal, or financial advice or services. The Digital Healthcare Experience is produced by Naomi Schwimmer. Podcast music by Nicholas Bach.
Informed consent is vital to patient care, but how can you help patients make informed decisions? Introducing iMed Health from Taylor Healthcare, digital tools that standardize and simplify the informed consent process. Go to imedhealth.com to learn more. Find the link in the show notes.